A lot of investigative journalism is about joining invisible dots and seeing how one thing causes another, and then horizon scanning to kind of look into the future and think, well, if this is happening now, what's going to be the impact of this continuing to happen over years? And some of that's about being good with data. I think a lot of it is about instinct.
On today's episode of Careers Unwrapped, we're thrilled to have Jessica Hill, who is a seasoned senior investigative journalist and features reporter. She's already got a career that spanned roles from regional coverage at the Echo to international coverage in the Middle East at the National. And she's now at Schools Week and FE Week. She's honed a really keen sense for news that not only informs, but also impacts, and has gained her multiple awards. And today she's joining us to share insights from her career, discuss the changes and nuances of investigative journalism, and also what it means to shine a light on untold stories. So welcome, Jessica.
Hello, Mark.
I think I'm going to dive straight in with just getting under the lid of what work's like at the moment for you. So asking you what perhaps over the last 12 months is a real career highlight and a low light.
I think in terms of the career highlights, I won a British Journalism Award for an article that I wrote about a certain type of crumbly concrete called rack, which was causing real problems in schools, and it led to the closure of over 100 schools last September. And I'd broken a story a few months before that, warning about the dangers of rack, which was then recognised for this award. And then a few months later, I was named Specialist Journalist of the Year at the Press Awards, which was a really big deal for me because I'm a specialist journalist at a niche specialist company that specializes in education. And the winners of these awards tend to nearly always be journalists at national newspapers. So it's really unusual for somebody within the trade press to win one of these awards. So it was a great honor. And it was just great to get recognition for a side of journalism. The specialist trade press are really the underdogs, but what we do is so incredibly important because we're experts in our field, and it's really, really important, particularly in this day and age, to have that expertise in what you're writing about. A low light, I would say, so currently my job is across FE Week, which is looking at colleges and apprenticeships, and Schools Week. So that means I'm working for two different publications. So juggling my time between the two is sometimes a bit tricky. And I had a particularly difficult article about parent complaints in schools rising, which I was trying to write at the same time as attending a conference on apprenticeships, and had to sort of pull an all-nighter to get everything done, and was feeling a little bit overwhelmed with work at the time. But sometimes you have those moments. So that was probably my low light, but definitely one that I've got over, and so that's just the nature of journalism. Sometimes you have these pressing deadlines.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that in a little more detail, because it already strikes a chord with me from other journalists I've spoken to through my working life. It is a job where highs and lows can be extreme, where the pressures can mount up, but also the joy and excitement of getting a scoop, of getting a byline, of getting a headline as you progress your career are huge as well. And let's go right back to the beginning then, because a lot of people who listen to this are those who are starting out in the early stages of their careers. What initially drew you to journalism as a whole?
I just wanted a really exciting life, I think. I always wanted to travel. And I remember reading a book by the war correspondent Kate Adie when I was a teenager, and found it fascinating, and thought when I was a teenager that it would be really exciting to be a war correspondent, because then I could travel and see all these different countries. And I think I was just a bit of a daredevil. I never did become a war correspondent because it really wouldn't have suited family life very well. And what I've come to realize through my life since then is that if you have a natural curiosity, which you can kind of keep nurturing in yourself, there are so many interesting things. Anything can be interesting that you write about. It's about having that natural curiosity. I'm fascinated by school funding issues, which when I was a teenager, I probably would have thought of as being very dull. But now writing about them, I find them really interesting. I think the more you get to know something, perhaps, and you see that as changes happen, that the more it is just naturally very interesting. So I've never been bored as a journalist, and I think not a lot of people can say that. You meet an awful lot of people who feel frustration in their lives that they end up in careers which they do sometimes find lack meaning and does get boring for them. But I would say I find my job very meaningful, and I always find it interesting. So that's what drew me to journalism, was just wanting that excitement. But then obviously the downside of that is that sometimes that excitement turns into stress, and you've got pressing deadlines and everything else. So you have to have that kind of personality where you're willing to accept the highs and lows.
And how old do you see, or what stage perhaps in your education, when you first thought that journalism could be a route for you, when that first spark was lit?
I went to Sussex University and studied contemporary history. And when I finished my degree, I'd kind of forgotten about the fact that I'd wanted to be a journalist. It wasn't really on my radar. But then I randomly decided to try and become a sabbatical officer for the Students' Union there, which there was you were elected into a position by ballot. And so I went for the position of communications officer. And that involved being managing editor of the student newspaper, magazine and radio station. And so I quickly realized when I got that job that the most exciting element of it, for me, was working on the newspaper. And although I was meant to be managing editor, I took on more of a sort of editor role, because that's just what I found really interesting about my job. And from there, I then decided afterwards to do what's called an NCTJ, which is a diploma, which I did in newspaper journalism in Brighton after that. And it kind of it evolved from there.
And you mentioned there an editor, a managing editor, and people outside the trade might have heard of these terms. But in a snapshot, what are the key roles on the editing side of things? Because one hears about sub-editors, editors, managing editors. What does each of them do?
So you'd have a team of reporters who are writing. The sub-editor would be looking at spelling and grammar and making sure things flow through for accuracy. And the editor is doing a bit of that, but it's also about pulling things together in a way that grabs the reader, and looking at how picking stories and giving ideas to journalists, things to write about, keeping abreast of all of the news going on and working out what we should be writing about. And I guess a managing editor normally would be more involved in the sort of background finances of the newspaper and building its brand, growing a company and that kind of thing.
And when you're looking at the next few things that you're going to be investigating or writing upon, what proportion of those ideas are ones that you propose? Say, look, there's something here, I want to look into it, as opposed to the editor coming to you and saying, please, can you write about this?
That's a really good question, actually. I'm glad you asked me, because I think there's a bit of a misconception, certainly I had when I first started in journalism, that it's more the editor's job to give you articles to write, but actually that's not really true at all. And the way to really make your mark in journalism is to be the ideas person who's just constantly pushing ideas at the editor, because being able to write is almost the easy bit. And I don't think it's necessarily the most important thing. I think it's actually more important these days to have ideas, to have really good ideas about what to write about, and to be good at knowing who to speak to and joining I always call it joining the dot. It's like you imagine this sort of invisible universe, and as a journalist, you're almost looking up and you're just connecting different things that you see happening and working out how things connect to each other. I don't know whether I'm explaining that very well, but a lot of investigative journalism is about joining invisible dots and seeing how one thing causes another, causes another, and then horizon scanning to kind of look into the future and think, well, if this is happening now, what's going to be the impact of this continuing to happen over years. And some of that's about being good with data. I think a lot of it is about instinct.
I find that fascinating, actually. It's the emphasis you've put or not put on the writing ability. Now, I'm not saying for a second that you have to be able to write, because you have to be able to read it and follow it and find it interesting. But you're almost, in my mind, playing that down against being the ideas person, against being the investigator, against the person who also has the networks and connections or can find them, against joining all of those dots together. And if you sort of have a whole set of pieces of pie that make up the brilliant investigative journalist, the writing is one small but important part of that.
It is. I mean, I suppose the reason why I say that is because as journalists, we're ever aware of the impact of AI and the impact that AI will have on our professions going into the future. So I think a lot of the standard, simple news articles in 10 years' time could potentially be written by a chatbot, unfortunately. So there is a whole tier of journalism that is sort of slowly being swept away as we speak. I don't think there's enough public recognition and understanding of that yet. And there's not been enough public dialogue about what we're losing in the process of that. But so I think journalists as a future, it's still a really important and exciting and fantastic profession to get into. But I think it'll be a different process to get into it, because you're not going to have that first rung of the ladder. You're going to have to jump high, because the simple writing that you would have done to learn your trade 5 years ago could be done by a chatbot. So you're going to have to sort of start with something else. And there's an awful lot of things that really good journalists are brilliant at that AI can't do. The most important being ideas, instincts, being a bit of an opportunist, where it's about the contacts and knowing people in a particular sector, knowing who to speak to, and then reaching out to them, going along to conferences and just being really open and friendly and asking the right questions to the right people.
So how are we going to trust news? Sorry, how are we going to trust news in the future when those in their, let's say, 40s, 50s or something would be used to having gained their news sources from areas where they trust the name. It might be the name of the newspaper. It might be the name of the specialist trade reporting that you do, for example, with Schools Week and FE Week. Whereas now what we know is that more than 50% of Gen Z, of Generation Z, as many people call them, get their news from social media and often from uncredited journalism within that. So how do we trust news reporting?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a tough one to answer. I mean, I think you just have to trust. There are certain media brands which have a good reputation for prioritizing the truth and not necessarily always being the first to jump on a story, because that's part of the problem. Sometimes the first ones to get the story aren't necessarily telling the most accurate story. But you just have to hope that the trusted brands keep prioritizing the right things going forwards. That it is really difficult. I don't know how else to answer that. I think as I said, it comes down to, I think the way I would if you look at 10 years ago, I think it might have been longer ago than that, but I think there were a lot of big companies that started to farm off a lot of their call centers to other countries. So you had big companies where you would phone up the number and you'd speak to somebody in Bangladesh. And there was a bit of a backlash to that, because people in this country said, well, actually, I really want to speak to somebody who understands my situation. And I want to get sort of more, I appreciate the importance of human communication. I'm not saying that people who live abroad don't have that human contact at all. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think, and some of those companies have since done a U-turn, and they've returned their call centers to this country because of that understanding that people do appreciate these things. And I think at the moment we're seeing lots of people jumping on chatbots as being the solution to lots of things, and I think it'll go the same way. I think lots of that will return to human contact when we come to appreciate more that is what people value. But lots of it won't, but some of it will, I'm sure.
I'm interested also in the difference between working for different types of publications. And I mentioned in the introduction that you would work for The National, which is very Middle Eastern focused, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about what they focus on. But after that, I believe you then went and worked in much more regional publications in East Anglia. And so how, first of all, did you start by working for The National with that Middle East audience focused? And then what was the difference when you started working in much more regional publications in the UK?
I had quite a long career break from journalism first. And that kind of makes my story slightly unusual compared to a lot of people. So what happened was when I finished university, I freelanced for a while, and then I went and worked for a local newspaper in Exeter, which was, I didn't want to live in London, and a lot of the opportunities in journalism, in national newspaper journalism, were in London. I wanted to live in a lovely rural place, so I chose to live in Devon. But the newspaper editor at the time didn't. He just didn't really like me. I hadn't passed my driving test, which was a big problem. I did eventually pass on my 7th attempt. So it took me a long time, but living in a rural area, I covered Dartmoor National Park, and there was a terrible bus service. So I couldn't get out to meet people. And I've just spoken before about the importance of meeting people if you can as a journalist, and to get that sort of source of contacts for stories. And to make what you're writing about authentic, you have to know those communities. And when you don't drive and you live in a rural area, it makes it much harder to do that. So my editor at the time just didn't particularly like me, and I was on a short-term contract, which he sort of threatened to not renew. And I jumped out of there because I felt like I might lose my job, and I wasn't particularly happy there. And I thought I went and lived in Barcelona and retrained to be an English teacher, teaching foreign students out there. And I believed that I wasn't a good journalist because I'd had this bad experience. And I was sort of lacking confidence at the time in my life. And because of the things that this one person said, I convinced myself that journalism wasn't for me, and I wasn't a good journalist. So I went off and became an English teacher. And I did that for a few years, and I quite enjoyed it, and moved to Abu Dhabi when I had 2 small children with my husband at the time, who was also an English teacher. And it was whilst I was there, I was at a children's playgroup with my daughter, and one of the dads there, his wife was an editor at the national newspaper. And I just got chatting to him about how I used to be a journalist many years ago. And he said, "Oh, send us some ideas. Send my wife some ideas. We're always looking for ideas." So I came up with some ideas and sent them, and it all worked out really well. And I was a freelance journalist out there for about 7 years. But I worked across 3 different sections of the same newspaper. So it was a full-time job, but being freelance meant I could work for different editors at the same time. So I did articles about family issues, arts and life, business, news, film reviews, all sorts of things. It was absolutely fascinating.
And you mentioned the hit that your confidence took with that first editor in Devon. How important do you think a high level of confidence and a thick skin, a level of resilience is in journalism, especially in investigative journalism?
I suppose having a thick skin is useful in situations like that. And obviously, when I look back now, I think I wish I'd had more confidence and realized that journalism's very subjective. So I could have 2 different editors looking at the same piece of work that I'd written, and one of them would think it was brilliant, and the other one might think it was a bit rubbish, because sometimes it can be quite subjective. So of course I didn't realize this at the time, and I was basing my opinion of my own abilities on one person who was actually a bit of a battle axe, and he didn't like quite a few of the journalists. When I look back, it wasn't just me. It was, he did fire people left, right and centre. And journalism in those days was a bit like that as well. I think it's less cutthroat these days. But I was definitely quite fragile. But I think, to be honest, as a really good interviewer, it's really important to be vulnerable. You have to be able to relate to people that you speak to. And in order for them to feel like they can let their guard down and be open and honest and vulnerable with you, you have to kind of be vulnerable back. And that doesn't mean sort of going on about yourself. I that's something I learned early on. I think I probably did spend half of my interviews talking about myself, that it was more of a conversation. And then I'd listen back to myself thinking, oh my God, what are you waffling on about as I'm writing it up. So I don't really talk about myself when I'm interviewing people these days, but I definitely do think they can sense it. If they feel like you're an open and honest person who's willing to be vulnerable yourself, then they will react well to that and be the same. And then you end up with a more authentic and realistic portrayal of the person they are, which is what you're trying to do. That's what the reader wants. They want to understand why this person does the things they do.
I think that's really interesting in relation to what you mentioned right at the beginning about the highlight of one of the highlights of this year is the award around the investigation pieces you wrote around the concrete failures, the rack concrete in schools, causing schools to be shut down, safety issues, and obviously needing a lot of budget now to get those schools repaired. Just in terms of your process with people as a journalist, because that sounds very factual. It's concrete, it's good or it's not, it's failing or it's not, it's in a school, which is a building and an organization. There isn't a lot of people coming out of that, but I'm making a presumption you can't get to the bottom of those stories without dealing with people, some of whom might be very defensive to begin with. So how do you go through the process under the investigative journalism banner of getting these people to tell you what you need, to open up, to create the dots that you can join together?
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting because the original RUC piece that I wrote, I believe the key to how I managed to get the information I was able to get, it came from a tip-off that I had from somebody. And I then went along to a conference called the Schools and Academies Show, where there were lots of people who work in education were there, and lots of stalls where you had companies that were selling things to schools. And they included surveyors and construction companies and those people. So it's people who weren't particularly media savvy, who were on the ground selling things to schools to repair their buildings. So in a situation like that, so if I'd been just sitting at home thinking, oh, there's some crumbly concrete someone's told me about, how am I going to find out how to do this? If I'd just gone to the schools and the Academy Trusts themselves, they would have just shut me down. They would have ignored my emails. And this is what I mean about AI can't do lots of things that journalists can do. So I went along to this conference, and it was actually my first week at my job at Schools Week. So I didn't really know very much about schools at the time, but I just went up to people with my voice recorder who were construction experts and just asked them to tell me everything they could about RAC. And it turned out to be something they were really, they were obviously happy to chat about, because they're trying to market their solutions to the problem to schools, but none of them had thought of ever approaching a journalist about it before, because it's kind of not really their, I suppose they would see it as not their place to do so. Do you know what I mean? It's not until a journalist actually approaches them that they think, well, yeah, it is a big issue. And then from there, I then did a freedom of information requests to councils in England about the numbers of schools that they knew were affected by RAC. So I was able to build up a national picture, but just being able to speak to people on the ground and getting those kind of sort of soundbite comments about how schools were falling apart, because of this crumbly concrete that nobody seemed to know about, was key to the whole thing. So that story wasn't pulling on the heartstrings as such. It was about crumbly buildings, but but not necessarily so much about the consequences of that. Because we haven't had any injuries, there haven't been any kids that have actually had brack falling on them that we know of. But then I have done follow-up pieces since then where I went and visited a school in Essex, which was had to be cordoned off. The main building had to be cordoned off because of rat. And it was just about the impact that having to manage the situation had on all the staff. And it had been really hard for them. So I kind of, did this follow-up piece that was looking at, what's the real human emotional impact of when things like this happen, which is harder to write. It's much harder to write when you're talking about emotions and people, and because you're having to tiptoe along this really fine balance between telling the truth and not wanting to embarrass the person because they don't necessarily want it splashed out in public that they've had sleepless nights for the last few weeks or something, so you have to be sensitive about it as well.
It's interesting how you put that, because I think a lot of us as outsiders of the trade would also think that there's a lot of journalists who wouldn't worry about upsetting people or embarrassing them, and it's anything for the story, but you obviously come at it from a slightly different angle. And I guess especially if you're dealing with schools, and therefore when they're disrupted, young people's education is disrupted, the parents and their lives are disrupted, it's stressful for the staff. There's a whole load of very personal issues going on around there. In sort of wider terms now, your career route has taken you, as even a short space of time, you've painted a picture of the first steps, the feeling of a lack of confidence after your experiences in Devon, moving out of the industry, the sector for a while, coming back into it in the Middle East, then back to the UK, success last year. There's a lot of experience packed into your career so far that's almost impossible to pull out in a short conversation like this. But what I would ask is, imagine you're talking to your younger self, going back to find 18, 19-year-old Jessica. What advice would you give to them? In essence, what do you think are the 2 or 3 main things you've learned about how to do this well that you wish you'd known when you started out?
I think I'm an opportunist. It's probably how I describe myself in terms of the huge variation of the things that I've written about. So I used to laugh at myself as a freelance journalist and think I was a jack of all trades and master of none. But as a specialist journalist, I like to think I'm a bit more of an expert these days. But I think I would say that I think when I was young, I was very wary about feeling sort of imposter syndrome, that if I went and worked at a national newspaper as a young woman, I felt I went and did work experience at the Daily Mirror. I also did work experience at the News of the World. And I just felt like I didn't fit in there at all. None of the broadsheet newspapers would give me any work, only the tabloids. But I found it quite an isolating experience doing work experience there. And I felt like I was sort of surrounded by middle-aged men who were very pleasant, but I just felt like I didn't really fit in. So I think that's why I went and worked in Exeter instead of sort of trying to climb to the top of my career in London for a national newspaper. And I think with hindsight, I think I probably, I sort of wish I'd tried a bit harder to work for a national newspaper then. I think I was very wary about the fact that I felt like they all worked really long hours. That I'd get into the office early in the morning and they'd all still be there, going into the evening. And I had to get a train back to Brighton at the time. So I felt like I would be the first one to leave. And I was very conscious thinking, oh God, they're all working ridiculous hours, which I think probably was part of the culture back then as well. I thought I didn't want that. I didn't want my life to be just work. But I think you can create the job that you want. So maybe for journalists going into it these days, I don't think you have to work ridiculous hours, but maybe putting in the extra effort in the first few years isn't it's not such a bad thing. Just to show that you're willing, because it is hard to get your foot in the door. So probably putting in that sort of going above and beyond in the first few years is important, but it doesn't have to be like that for the rest of your life. I think if I could give myself one message, it'd probably be that these days, good quality journalists are really valued, and it is possible to create the job that you want rather than just feeling like you have to be to fit in with what somebody else wants.
Yeah, I think the point you made there about perhaps wishing you'd maybe put in more of the extra effort at the beginning, or not wishing you had, but thinking if you had, it might have been a bit different, is a very interesting one. We talk to a lot of career starters, those in their early 20s or so at the moment, who there is no doubt are far more aware of having a balance in their life between their time at work and their time not at work than those 2 generations ago. But it is still important, if you want to succeed, that you are prepared to put effort in at the beginning. A bit like putting the foundations in of the building, the better, stronger they are at the beginning, the more you've got to build upon them. But it's clearly up to each individual to choose the balance that's right for them. I think
that you love. If you're doing a job you love, you don't mind putting in the hours anyway. I suppose that's the point. If you're really living your dream and doing a job that you love, then it doesn't matter too much, especially when you're young and before you have a family and all those things. It's
8 or 9 hours doing something that fascinates you flies by, and 3 or 4 hours of doing something that bores you to pieces lasts forever, without a doubt. I've been really interested, Jessica. Thanks so much for the pieces you've brought out there. I've sort of been trying to get my head around, right, how does someone in an early stage of their career think, is journalism for me or not? And the things that I really drew out from you, that if you're someone who has natural curiosity, if you really like sort of the investigative part of connecting the dots, looking at the data, looking at what the people said, if you like meeting people genuinely and finding out from them, if you can be the ideas person and actually trigger the thinking right at the beginning, and also if you can put up with the real requirement for deadlines, because that's a very real part of every journalist's job. If all of those things make you think, that's me, then journalism offers such variety of roles, such variety of publications, sectors to look into, types of media to work for. It really offers so many different directions. But
I mean, the thing is, it's people think there's a misconception that the story of the media in recent years is one of decline, but actually it's fragmentation. That there are the big newspapers that everybody used to go and work for in the past, some of those are in decline and there are job losses there. But there are lots and lots of smaller publications and media websites that can be really, really fun to work for. And also you can, as I said, you can make the job work for you. There's an awful lot of journalism jobs now that are work from home 2 or 3 days a week, and then you go in the office. So, that can help with work-life balance too, I think.
Well, I've loved hearing about it. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think actually, Jessica, it's brought out a bit of the frustrated not journalist inside of me actually as well. But it's been really useful and really interesting. I think anyone thinking about whether journalism is for them or not, or even that they know it is and they're thinking what to do, I think this is really useful, really insightful. And Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and for unwrapping your career to date with us today.
I do hope so. And as I said, I would advise anyone who's interested in being a journalist to really think beyond the sort of stereotype you might have about what a journalism job entails, and actually go on there and find there are a lot of specialist publications out there that are really, really interesting to write for, and becoming an expert in a particular sector can be extremely valuable. And it can also be a really good stepping stone onto other things. So lots of people who work for niche publications, for example, like Schools Week, can go on and work for an education think tank in the future, or go and work for the Department for Education. So even if you don't see yourself as being a journalist for life, those kind of jobs can quite often lead to other things as well.
Brilliant. Jessica, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
This podcast is sponsored by We Are Futures. To find out more about We Are Futures, and how we can introduce your brand, business, or organisation to the mass markets of tomorrow, visit www.wearefutures.com. Make sure to search for Careers Unwrapped in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Remember to click subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at We Are Futures, thanks for listening.